In this talk, I'm going to be discussing a poem celebrating the restorations and improvements carried out at Strata Florida Abbey by Abbot Morgan in the 15th century. The poem is particularly valuable because it provides a vivid description of the Abbey church, of which very little survives today, apart from the iconic west door pictured here. And the poem enables us to imagine how the church would have looked in its heyday. It's a hyperbolical description, in places even a playful one, and the creative imagination of the poet gives it an exuberant sense of wonder and delight. Dafydd Nanmor was a poet from North Wales and one of the great masters of classical Welsh praise poetry. He made his living by travelling around the country, visiting gentry houses. And of course, one of his regular ports of call would have been Strata Florida Abbey, where he would have been an honoured guest of the abbot. And this poem would have been performed before an audience there, and also probably elsewhere, as a means of enhancing Morgan's reputation as a generous patron and benefactor. It's not possible to date the poem precisely. All we really have to go on are dates for the time when Morgan was abbot of Strata Florida. We have two dates. The earliest is 1458 and the latest is 1486. My best guess is that this poem was probably composed in the 1460s or 1470s, when Dafydd Nanmor was very much at the height of his career as a poet, but we can't say with any more precision than that. Just a quick word about the poem's transmission. The only complete text is in the hand of the 17th century antiquarian Robert Vaughan of Hengwrt in Meirionethshire, some 200 years after the original composition. But the last 8 lines of the poem are preserved in a 16th century manuscript, which did originally contain the whole text apparently, and was probably the source of Vaughan's copy. And that manuscript had associations with the Cistercian Abbey of Vallecrucis in northeast Wales. So it's likely that this poem was transmitted through the Cistercian network from Strata Florida to Vallecrucis. In fact, the poem may well have been performed by Dafydd Nanmor himself at Vallecrucis and then written down there. The poem is in the cowydd metre, which consists of rhyming couplets of 7-syllable lines. Each line is embellished by the decorative feature known as cynghanedd, an elaborate system of sound correspondences required in Welsh strict metre poetry. My English translation is not able to reproduce that feature at all. So if you depend on the translation alone, then you will be missing quite a bit of the effect of the original poem. I would read out the passages quoted on the slides so that you get an idea what cynghanedd sounds like. But before coming to the poem, I'll just show you an artist's impression of what the Abbey Church would have looked like. In this cutaway drawing, you can see the roof, both from underneath and from above, the pillars supporting it, the windows, and the bell tower at the crossing point of the cruciform church, all of which are depicted in the poem. You also see the west door, at the bottom left of the picture. So we will come back to that picture again as we consider each feature. So here are the opening lines of the poem, presenting the abbey as it would have appeared to the approaching visitor, placing it on the banks of the River Tavy and giving an overview of the extent of the site with, as we are told, 8 score gates in its perimeter walls. Now, that's a vast exaggeration, of course. It's a kind of ideal rounded number suggesting multiplicity. We know of at least 3 main gates, which are marked here on this plan drawn up by David Austin. Gates to the north and south and west. There would have been other gates into the inner precinct. The following couplet names Abbot Morgan as the one responsible for the building work and sets it in the European context of the Cistercian order by referring to his fame reaching as far as Burgundy. The Welsh form here is Burgwyn. Burgundy was the region where the original Cistercian house was founded at Cito. And note, by the way, the opportunistic cynghannedd between the mutated forms of the name Morgan and the place name Burgwyn. Both M and B mutate to the V sound, so Vorgan, Vergwyn. So here's how these 4 lines sound. Y tŷ o lan Teifi las, 8 geunporth i'th gwmpas, a mae gair am ei gweiriaw, I forgan dros Vergwyn draw. The next 2 couplets focus in on the church itself, noting the glass windows, which would have been a particularly impressive feature catching the eye of the visitor standing outside the church. You can see the windows in this drawing on the upper parts of the walls of the church and filling the wall at the east end. Glass was an expensive commodity, and there would have been a lot of it in all those windows, although again we do see quite an exaggeration here when the poet claims that they cost half the wealth of the island. The reference at the end of line 8 to one of Morgan's predecessors, Abbot Rhys, sets the building work in a historical context as an ongoing project over several decades. We know from praise poems by Gytor Glyn that Abbot Rhys funded restorations in the 1430s, making good the depredations the abbey had suffered when it was occupied by English troops during the Glyndŵr Rebellion in the early 15th century, between 1401 to 1415. Apparently at that time the church was used as stables for the soldiers' horses. Y cor, efo ei cweiriawdd a dorau teg o wydr tawdd. Aeth hanner gwerth I hynys I wydro hwn wedi Rhys. A major part of the restoration work seems to have involved a new roof with sheets of lead, although these are not actually shown on the artist's reconstruction, which only has tiles on the roof. This lead roofing is conveyed by some quite intricate images which require careful interpretation. The lead roof suggested to the poet the metaphor of a suit of armour, using the borrowing cuirass from French cuirasse. A cuirass was a suit of armour which protected both the front and back of the body. So the church is envisaged as a human body fully enclosed by its armour, its lead roof. A few lines further on we find another borrowing along the same lines, brigance from English brigandine, a coat of mail, and you'll see an image of that on the next slide. The lead is then likened to clothing, to gowns, which are said to be the colour of January rye being a crop which grows in winter, and also the colour of marl, i.e. lime water, which is used as fertiliser in agriculture, and then hoarfrost, llwydrew. Now all these images represent a white colour over something darker underneath, presumably referring to the patina which develops on lead roofs over time due to oxidization, as can be seen on the image on this slide of Salisbury Cathedral roof. You see the left part of the roof there showing that white colour due to oxidization. The wooden frame supporting the roof is then compared to the woodwork in the Church of Rome, presumably St. Peter's. And in the final couplet here, there's a sudden shift from the visual to the auditory, depicting the choral music with its mixture of voices rising up through the lead roof of the church. Ystrad fflir ar waith curas, a gynnau plwm I gan plas. Lliw'r gynnau oll rhig Ionawr, lliw dŵr marl fel llwydrew mawr. Ar ei chor, llawer toriad ar fainc cor rhifain ei cad. Teg yw sŵn byrdwn lle bo, trebl a men trwy blwm yno. And you see there the three English borrowings for the musical terms, bwrdon, treble and mean. And incidentally, the reference to treble there perhaps suggests that boys were singing in the choir at Strata Florida, which raises then the possibility of a school at the Abbey where boys would have been taught some Latin and to read and write and sung in the choir. It has been proposed that the poet Dafydd ap Gwilym in the 14th century was educated at Strata Florida in that sort of way. The next four lines convey the size of the church with reference to the practice of burial within its walls, claiming that even if 1,000 kings were buried there, which presumably refers to the members of the royal line of Deheubarth who were buried at Strata Florida, even then there would still be enough room to bury more lords. Pe bain fil, pawb yn I fedd, feirw yn hon o frenhinedd, a mai rhwng I muriau hi, erw I gladdu ar glwyddi. We come back then to the roof, and again the image of the lead as woven clothing for the great pairs of beams supporting the roof, for which the architectural term used here was couplai, couples. And here we see that metaphor of the brigounce, the coat of mail, which I referred to a moment ago. And again, we find it forming Cynghanedd with the name Morgan through mutated forms like Byrgwyn, above Forgan Vrigawns. I've included a picture on this slide which shows how similar this sort of armour could look to sheets of lead. Gwisgwyd oll, gwisg hyd a llawr, gweau plwm am gyplau mawr. O ugain we I gŵn haf, o gan gwe I gŵn gaeaf. Y gweoedd hyn a'i gwydd hi, forgan sydd, vrigawn syddi. The next section conveys the height of the roof and marvels at the amount of oak in the beams. And on this slide I've included two pictures to illustrate the roof looking from underneath. On the left you have the cutaway image showing those beams resting on the stone pillars and reaching out across underneath the lead roof. And then the image on the right shows the rows of coupled beams stretching all the way down the body of the church, as they would have been seen by someone standing underneath in the nave looking along towards the east. We do see, I think, a very strong sense of perspective in these lines, and it's actually a two-directional perspective. To begin with, you've got the eastwards direction towards the altar, looking from the west door eastwards towards the altar, and then you've got the direction upwards towards the apex of the roof, as if the eye is following this arrow shot that's referred to convey the height of the roof upwards. A key term here is aberth, literally sacrifice, which refers to the host, that is the consecrated wafer of the Eucharist, which would have been raised up by the priest at the climax of the Mass. And that is that, again, you have this upwards movement towards heaven. I think what we see here is architecture and spirituality coming together. The height of the roof conveying that impulse to reach up towards heaven. Un dydd ni rifwn o'i dor I deri oll hyd yr allor. Ergyd saith o ddergoed serth yw I chryb uwch yr aberth. Mae derw rhom a dwyrain, rif myrdd ar ddwau maen. The audience listening to this poem being performed at Strata, Florida, may well have just enjoyed a feast at the abbot's expense, and would certainly have agreed with the poet's claim in these next lines that all the expenditure on building work had not caused any reduction in the hospitality in the abbot's house. That is, it is referred to, the term used for his house is place there. This would have been his personal lodgings on the abbey site. And there's no sense here of the original Cistercian ideal of austerity. What we see here is the abbot enjoying worldly pleasures with his guests, just like any secular nobleman would have done. And we see the ideal of generosity here, his generosity towards his guests, reflecting equally his liberality in paying for the building work. I gost wrth wir a gwaith a cheginau chwe geinwaith. Nibi air mwyn o barwn am leihau saig am plas hwn. Mwyn o'i glich ni mynau glos na ne addau na niddos. And we see a reference there to bells in that last couplet. We know that a great bell was purchased for Strata, Florida in 1255, and I imagine that would still have been there in the 15th century. It's the plural that's used here, so there would have been other bells. Mind you, we're not. This is not a matter. Would not have been a matter of the kind of change ringing which we may be familiar with today. That came in during the Protestant Reformation. The bells in an abbey in the Middle Ages would have been used to mark the ecclesiastical hours, calling to prayer. The reference to bells in the previous section brings the focus back to the church roof, because on top of the roof there was a bell tower, painted white, the poet tells us, like the Tower of London, known in Welsh as a Tŵr Gwyn, and with a weathercock on top of the tower. So that would have been the very highest point of the whole edifice. The height of the tower is emphasized by the extravagant claim that it would have been high enough to keep the images of the saints in the church safe and dry even during the biblical flood. Plochdi mawr calchaid Mirwyn, cort o'r gwaith caer y Tŵr Gwyn. Pwy a edrych bob hydref, golwg uwch no'i geiliog ef. Pan by'r dŵr I gain hwryd, heb un bont uwch ben y byd, gallai hwn I argerig lliw, gadw y delwai rhag diliw. The church is then compared to the legendary hall of the founder of the royal dynasty of Deheubarth, Tewdwr Mawr. And incidentally, I believe that the Tudor dynasty, founded by Henry VII in the late 15th century, actually derived its English name Tudor from Tewdwr, since they were descended from him through a daughter of the Lord Rhys of Deheubarth, the founder of Strata Florida Abbey. The usual interpretation of Tudor is that it's from the Tudur family of Anglesey, but I think that the sound of the word Tudor works better as a borrowing from Tewdwr, and that would have given the Tudor family a Welsh royal lineage, which would have been extremely important to them. And then the other historical reference in this paragraph is a European one to St. Benedict in line 52, Benti Bened. St. Benedict was regarded as the father of Western monasticism, and I've included on this slide an idealized picture of him with his monastery at Monte Cassino in the background. I hope you can just make out the buildings behind the image of Benedict in that picture. We do see here, running throughout the poem, a very strong international perspective with references to Burgundy, to Rome, to London, and now again to Italy, Monte Cassino. It's really got quite broad international horizons. So I'll read the first part of the text on the slide. Toai a flwm trwm tramawr, ti deri maint Tewdwr Mawr. To ar wydd, ni ad trwy ddaw rew na gwlyb na geiri na glaw. Mae'n costio iddo ar wydd, Benti Bened, bint beinydd. And I hope you can hear the Cynghanedd in those lines. For instance, in that first line, you have what's known as Cynghanedd sign, where we have a rhyme between two words, flwm and trwm, and then alliteration between trwm and tramawr. That forms Cynghanedd sign. And on the other hand, in line 52, the end of that little section, you have Cynghanedd groes, which is just a matter of a repeated sequence of consonants, Benti, Bened, bint, beinydd, butnt, butn, in the two halves of the line, so that the line forms a complete unit, the first half reflected by the second. That figure given in line 52 of £1 a day for expenditure on timber for the roof need not be taken literally, but £1 certainly would have been a considerable sum at that time. The following couplet is incomplete in the manuscript, so I've left a gap in the text. That's what those dots represent. It's only 2 lines that we've lost here. I'm pretty sure we've got the rest of the poem preserved for us. Emphasis on the cost of the work continues in the next lines, returning to what were probably the most expensive items, the glass windows, which have been described at the beginning of the poem. There's a reference here to the colour of the glass, which is said to be the same as the colour of panes of glass in England, which might lead us to imagine that there was stained glass in the windows at Strata Florida. I don't know whether that's likely. In principle, the Cistercians were certainly opposed to such worldly vanity. And it is a singular form, hue, colour, which may simply represent the brightness of the glass rather than any multicoloured staining as we're familiar with. Mawr yw cost ar y mir cai a'i gair wydr a'i gairedau. Llu gairedau yn cai rhag gwynt, lliw gairedau Lloegr ydynt. The final 2 couplets of the poem consist of a blessing, wishing Morgan a long life. It's interesting that the work on the roof beams is presented here as still ongoing. It appears that Dafydd Nanmor must have visited Strata Florida at a stage when the work was not yet finally completed, but close enough to enable him to describe and celebrate it. We can tell from the tense of the verb here, gwedi caffo, that this is something he's going to complete this in the future. It hasn't yet happened finally. I'll read those lines for you. Gwedi caffo goed cyffion I gwplau holl gyplau hon. Bob byw yno I bob ynys bedwar oed ar abad Rhys. The poet's wish is that Morgan should have a life 4 times as long as that of his predecessor, Abbot Rhys. Now, a fact of which the original audience would have been very aware is that Rhys died in a debtor's prison in Carmarthen, probably about 1440, so maybe some 20 or 30 years before the time this poem was composed, but still I think the memory would have been very much alive at Strata Florida. And it may be that he was in that debtor's prison as a result of over expenditure on the restoration of the abbey, which he was certainly paying for during his time as abbot. The point of this reference then may have been partly to reassure Abbot Morgan and his companions that no such fate need befall him. And given the dates that we have for Morgan's abbacy, spanning a period of at least 28 years between 1458 and 1486, he doesn't seem to have done too badly. If it wasn't for this poem, we would know virtually nothing about his achievements at that time. However, it is worth noting the possibility that the writing slates discovered on the site, some of which contain passages of Welsh poetry, may date from Morgan's period as abbot, and they certainly are an indication of the level of Welsh culture at Strata Florida at this time, as is this poem. I hope I've said enough to give you some idea of the artistry of Dafydd Nanmor's poem and of its value as a historical document, preserving not just a factual record of the church, but I think more importantly, a sense of the powerful impression that the church would have made on visitors to the abbey. Abbot Morgan himself would no doubt have been delighted with the poem and would have certainly paid Dafydd Nanmor handsomely for this fine composition.